And our political commentators today, it's Gareth, Hughes and Tim Hurdle. Thanks very much for coming in, gentlemen. Good morning.
Kia ora morena.
Good morning.
Gareth is the director of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance Aotearoa, a former Green MP, no longer a member of any political party. Tim is a former National Party senior advisor, consultant and director of several companies. He was this year the campaign director for Auckland Mayor Wayne Brown's election campaign. Shall we begin with the RMA reform bills? Long awaited. This might feed into some of the other things that happened last week. Long awaited they are. Two pieces of legislation proposed to replace the existing and much amended RMA. Gareth, your reaction to what was revealed last week, please.
Yeah, long awaited and very long documents. The two bills run to 452 and 292 pages, so a huge amount of detail and uncertainty for people to grapple with. Some key summer reading for a lot of folks across the country. But, I think National sees this as a popular issue. Chris Bishop's trying to tap into Ezra Klein's abundance discourse, the idea it's regulations and the overweening bureaucracy that's holding back all the good things we need in society. And over recent years, it's become an unpopular whipping boy. The RMA's become the scapegoat for all of our ills. Previous governments have really grappled to transform it. We've seen, decades of tweaks, and this is a wholesale reform of it. So it's a huge reform process that he has bitten off. What we're seeing, though, is I think some pretty smart comms from Chris Bishop. Effectively, what he's doing is conflating all the reasonable stuff, the building decks, the height of fences, with the big things, which is things like open cast mines and motorways, which can really bring a lot of misery to people's lives. It's going to be a much more permissive regime. About 46% of activities that currently needed consent won't do at the same time. But what I fear is really it's going to be the environment that's going to be the huge loser in this reform package, this new permissive regime where the treaty is weakened, there's less public say, at the same time as dismantling the regional councils, our main environmental regulators. That's going to be my big fear for the long term.
Tim, your reaction to what was revealed?
I thought it was an amazing piece of work. This has been an issue pretty much since that bill came in, since the mid-90s. People have felt that it probably didn't get the balance right. As Gareth says, there's been numerous attempts at tweaking it, changing it. Labor had their own go at it the last term. There's been numerous reviews, and it's been surprising how well, considering how complicated and large this reform has landed. We've got environmental groups complaining, but you've also got a fairly good reaction. Even the Labor Party have been muted in their criticism, don't seem to be wanting to go head to head on it. I think it will create some certainty. For a country of 5 million people and one land mass, we ended up with a very large, bureaucratic and detailed planning system that had so many variations that I think we were losing the benefits. I think Chris Bishop has heard the message about protecting what's important to New Zealand, the environment. Some of those culture and heritage issues are still, I think, protected by the way he's going forward with this. And I think there's also a realisation that by further consultation and work, we hopefully can get to a better place. And I hope that we can see a bipartisan consensus, because this is a piece of legislation that has decades-long, if not generational, impacts on our country and economy. So by getting a piece of paper like this right, we will set ourselves up for longer-term success as a country.
I know one other.
Can I pick up on?
Oh, go ahead, Gareth. Sorry.
Can I pick up on that point? Because I think the bipartisan consensus is an important one, as Tim points out. And Labor's come out saying, effectively, they're going to look at ways to support. They don't want to rescind the legislation yet again with the flip-flops if they can help it. I think they're taking the high ground. I think it's a good principle that any reasonable person could support. But, I think they do need to look at this a little bit sceptically and cynically. We've seen the coalition government not respect this principle. We've seen dishonouring agreements like the ferries, the Paris Climate Agreement. We've seen retrospective changes from pay equity to the marine and coastal areas, customary titles bill. So, yes, we need bipartisan consensus, but it's not just a one-way street.
Well, that'll be interesting when they actually get into the select committee process, whether there are the kinds of compromises that could make this last. I know some environmental groups have seen some positive, some clarifications actually in parts of the bill, while obviously being concerned about others. But, do we have the kind of parliament where you can sit down and do some serious negotiating and come out with something that can last. Is that the track record of this Parliament, both of you?
Oh, I think it's a historic failing of our Parliament. I remember working with Trevor Mallard when he was the Speaker, trying to find some ways we could bake some incentives into the standing orders to encourage that. It's really unclear how you could do it. The standing orders don't really offer many meaningful ways to encourage the parties to work together. Ultimately, I think it's a political, cultural issue.
It's a select committee issue, isn't it? Isn't this the issue? Isn't this where laws really frequently get really nutted out and bad laws made better if the select committee process works well before they come back to the committee of the whole House? And, again, is this an opportunity to actually do things the way a Parliament ought to be doing them, which is trying to get something lasting and trying to make improvements and trying to see if there are commonalities? What do you think, Tim?
Yeah, I think that's the thing. If those select committees actually are given the space to work and the political pressure is taken off them. I've seen it on bills like the Auckland Council Select Committee and things like that. There's numerous examples where a select committee, if it's given the right makeup and the right bunch of people, can actually seriously improve a piece of legislation, and that creates at least the framework of getting 80 or 90%. I think part of the problem with our political system, of course, multiple parties, there's always an opportunity to differentiate yourself by finding something to oppose. I think if you go back through the record, you'll find very few times that even quite unifying, say the gun laws, or I think the Christchurch earthquake legislation, there was always a party that would sort of oppose it, just as a positioning almost. So it is hard to get a complete consensus on a complete agreement. But that's sort of the nature of UMP. It incentivises you to sit out the side on some things.
Look, I've seen it in select committees when they're working well, but this might bring us to our next point. Select committees are very short currently, and the amount of urgency that is happening. One of the newsroom reporters says it's the greatest volume since at least 1987. What's the for and against of the use of a lot of urgency? I think I don't know what time they wrapped up at the weekend, but they've just finished another bout of it, right? I'm not sure what the status is now. But too much at the moment, Gareth, or a government getting on with it? Which is it?
Oh, it's definitely too much. I mean, at the halfway point of this term, it was more bills going through all stages without a select committee, a public input since 87, probably much earlier than that. And since that half-year point, it's only continued since then. I mean, Parliament was in business till 1:40 a.m. on Friday night. I think people want to see their MPs work hard, but I think people also want to see good lawmaking and good democratic principles, which is the antithesis of rushing bills through all stages under urgency. All governments have done it. I think they've used it too much, but what we're seeing is a government using it on a whole other level. It's hypocritical. National was a strong critic when they were in opposition of the previous government's much more moderate use of urgency. And I think, I'd just point out that this is very Muldoonist. You've got to go back to that period of our history where we're seeing a real concentration of power, not only in the executive, but in specific ministers' individual decision-making powers. We're seeing decisions rammed through. I mean, as a counterpoint, when I was back a politician, I went to Jerry Brownlee when he was Nationals leader of the House saying, look, there's an alternate mechanism Parliament can use. It's called extended hours when you do this business in the morning rather than the evening. And I went to them and saying, here's all the government bills we support. Let's work together to get the good stuff passed. There is an alternate practice they could be using, but they're not. In fact, I think the government's hoping that people don't pay attention and just see that they're working hard and passing a whole number, the quantity of bills rather than the quality.
I mean, Tim, there's a bit of an irony when they fast-track the fast-track amendment bill. Climate change legislation again going through. What's your view?
I think there's a logistical challenge about the amount of legislation they've got on the order paper at the moment that they're trying to get moved through. There is a problem when you've got to move, there's something like 50 items on the order paper, which is a lot. And some of these bills are actually quite clear in their intent and have been worked through, and just getting the House time to get these things through can be challenging. That becomes the logistical challenge. There's always an argument about whether it should have more time. I generally am in favour of giving a bill more time because at least you get a chance to iron out some of the problems and you don't have to come back to it. But I think this is a government that's got an agenda and urgency that they want to get things done. So I can see why we are where we are.
Some key figures to land this week. I think CPI latest is tomorrow, the HIFU, which the government's books out tomorrow, GDP out on Thursday. A lot of focus possibly on the two former. Is there any kind of easing on the upper limits of the Reserve Bank's band and what that might signal about forward track for interest rates? But the HIFU. Things went a bit awry last week, and we'll talk more about whether that should have happened or not in a moment. What are we anticipating? That, again, the books will look a little worse than Treasury had earlier projected? Will it be a lot worse, or will it be ho-hum? What do you think, Tim?
I think the out years will probably look better. The short-term financial data sort of suggests that things might be a bit rough. We are starting to see some economic data that looks very positive. And the revision of the GDP number will come in on Thursday for the previous quarter, which looked very black in the previous writing, but it will look a lot better this time.
Do you think that 0.9 quarter will get revised down? Is that what you're saying, or revised up?
I don't think there's a person who thinks that number will stay at that number.
Okay.
I think most people think it'll go to quite significantly down. And I think that's one of the reasons why all this sideshow about the taxpayer union is kind of surprising, because there's potentially some very strong economic news for the government at the end of the week. And I wouldn't have thought, and after the RMA, that distracting it by challenging those numbers is... the ability of those numbers to get in front of the public is a good idea.
Was that a mistake by the Finance Minister to front foot this taxpayer union campaign and front foot Ruth Richardson's comments on it? Should she have just left them to it? What?
Oh, I don't... You're always getting lobby groups coming at you, pushing you and testing you. Why you particularly picked that fight confuses me. I'm not sure what they're attempting to get out of it, but maybe it'll be revealed.
Okay. Gareth, first on the HIFU numbers, the government's books. How much does it matter that the Finance Minister has a story to tell about an eventual return to surplus, however far out, from the perspective of being a National Finance Minister?
Well, it is important, and this is what the taxpayer union's doing, trying to drive a much faster austerity path to achieve that, rather than looking at the revenue side of the equation. But, Treasury's most recent set of forecasts suggests it's going to take about 11 years to get a 340 million surplus by 2031. Historically, these surpluses are always just over the horizon. They're 4 years or plus ahead. The fact of the matter is this year's budget, sorry, I'm losing track of my years. There was the big pay equity kitty or piggy bank to crack and take that funds. It's unlikely we're going to see other similar size amounts of easy savings for the government to be able to identify. So we already know they've got incredibly tight allowances. Some of their operating allowance has already been allocated. So less money next year for the budget for new initiatives. But that crucial issue of debt, the deficit, when that will be, that's what everyone's looking out for. And this is exactly what the taxpayer union is trying to do, trying to set the terms of the narrative or the debate.
Okay. The latest polls, very mixed messages. TVNZ poll came out. There would have been champagne corks popping, possibly, because it was a strong result for the incumbent coalition government and for National. Then the taxpayer union Curia one comes out with a different story. I mean, they move around. But what do you make of the latest indicators of mood?
I thought the Varian poll was a bit of an outlier. They don't match up with numbers I'm seeing, and it'll be interesting to see. I know there's other polling coming out as we get towards the end of the week, so that will cause some further analysis. But I think it ultimately we are seeing the economic recovery is starting to come away in the data. But we're yet to see that reflected in a return and an improvement in the government's numbers, particularly Nationals, or in economic confidence. So it's a question of how long that lag effect sits around before we see some lift in the polls. I think Labour has got a degree of support and it has lifted its base, and it remains to be seen how strong that support will be as we get into election year.
Well, it's interesting, is it an outlier or is it the herald of how the polls could change, over summer into the new year? The Greens down a big 4 points to 7 does feel like a bit of an outlier. This is the time of the COP climate talks. The government's been dismantling a whole bunch of climate initiatives. Surprising to see the Greens drop so far, unless they're getting hammered for being a little quiet and not visible on it. The Taxpayer Union poll had Te Pāti Māori at 3%, only down 0.2%, which I find a little hard to believe given the massive media coverage and the real sense of disillusionment that people are deeply unhappy with the split within Te Pāti Māori. The Varian had them down to 1%, showing perhaps that particular trend going forward. But what's clear is that it's still the battle of the blocks, Labour and National in the early 30s to mid-30s, but that the coalition has more options, with New Zealand First and ACT holding up pretty strongly. Labour, even if their polling is better than it was at the last election, needs coalition partners if they're going to reclaim the government, and that's their big challenge going forward.
Okay, just your key thoughts. Finish your thoughts, sorry.
I wasn't surprised to see the Greens go down, because I think their primary issue that they've been driving all year has been the conflict in Gaza, and that's what they've made their song and dance about. With that issue with the ceasefire, it has dropped in prominence, and I guess with that particular voting group needs motivation to be excited about voting, and I think with that issue dropping away, they probably are looking around and thinking more about other issues, and Labour is probably talking more about some of the issues that they might be interested in. So I was less surprised by that.
All right. Now, your thoughts then as the year ends, a bit of a stock take on key points about where things are at as we stand, and then what to look for as we get into 2026. The sort of talk about leadership rumbles obviously receded after a fairly kind of furious round of rumours a couple of weeks ago. What else are you looking at for the early stages of next year to determine how election year is going to play out? Gareth?
Well, as it is every year, it's going to be the economy, the defining feature. The government's losing the narrative on that. According to the polls, it shows that people prefer Labour and trust them on that crucial issue of the economy, cost of living. People looking around are seeing interest rates actually going up at the moment. Minimum wage, recent announcement came out last week, was below inflation. So that's 3 years in a row that minimum wage workers are going backwards in such a tough environment. Things like Three Waters are going to cost $9 billion more than the previous estimate. And we still see that, a high number of outflow, sort of almost an economic migration, people fleeing New Zealand. So I think that's going to be the dominant issue. For National, the question is, can these, you do need a magnifying glass to see the green shoots, but there are some green shoots there. Will that tailwind economically help them reclaim that most trusted status on the economy, or does Labour have a real advantage on the top issue? There's going to be huge unknowns next year. Trump is like a wild card. We just don't know what's going to happen with geopolitics, potential great power conflict, potential conflicts in Venezuela. We see our extreme weather getting worse and worse. So there's a whole bunch of things that we can't prepare for. But what we do know is it's going to be a drag race between the blocks. It's fair to say National has an easier pathway. I think Luxon's leadership is safe. Last time I was on with you, Kathryn, we talked about some of the implications and risks of changing leader. But what is different is there is now an heir apparent, someone who that everyone seems to be rallying around, which is Christopher Bishop, which is a different set. I think he's safe in the new year, but there is an alternative out there now. The big issue, though, I think, is that Max Rashbrook had a very interesting article in the papers on the weekend, which was, he called it the angry centre. He described this current paradox of New Zealand politics, that the public is the angriest it's been for decades, but there's no sense it's shifted decisively left or right. No party really is taking that big disruptive power which we see reshaping the Republicans in the US, or the decline of Labour and the Tories in the UK, the rise of Reform, and the Greens polling at 20% in the UK. No party's really grabbing that sense of difference. So while both major parties are likely to play it safe, they've both got their slightly unpopular ideas, or maybe perhaps more controversial, which is asset sales and superannuation rises on the right and a capital gains tax on the left. But it's the coalition partners that I think will be the interesting one to watch next year, where they're polling, whether they're bringing seats to the coalition formation numbers, which is so crucial, and that's where the new ideas and new policies are coming from.
Tim?
It's all about the economy. where the economy fires up. If the economy fires up and National can be seen to be taking the credit for that, then they will see a boost in their polls and Labour will decline. And then if they're not, then the scrutiny will come on the Labour Party as to whether they're a valid alternative. And that will in itself put a lot of pressure on the Labour Party. Chris Hipkins, we've had him as Prime Minister before. He's promising to do something different. It's a very big challenge when you've been Prime Minister to present yourself as something different. So that's his big challenge. And I think the ultimate test will come down to an election in November as to who's got that credibility around the economy and the ability to have purchasing power as a Kiwi.
Thanks, both of you, very much. And thanks for all your time with us this year. Happy Christmas and hopefully some holidays for you and your families. Tim Hurdle and Gareth Hughes.